Member for Durack. The question is that this bill, the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak on the Tax Laws Amendment Combating Multinational Tax Avoidance Bill 2015. To quote Benjamin Franklin, "In this world nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes." Now, with medical advances, I think death can be deferred, but I think it's still pretty certain, Deputy Speaker. But maybe when we come to tax, it's not quite as certain as it was under Benjamin Franklin, certainly in his day. The way business is conducted has fundamentally changed. The way we consume products has fundamentally changed. We live in a global digital society where we purchase products that can be delivered to us in a digital format. There are no cassettes in my Sony Walkman when I go for a walk. Instead, it's an iPod where I can access music from around the world. So it is much less certain today where those products, even songs, where they're made or where a company's transactions are taking place. Companies have been able to take advantage of the transient nature of modern corporate business ventures to structure their corporate affairs and shift profits to low tax or no tax regimes. And we heard a little bit about that last week in this place. So this is a very real problem for modern governments, where the nation-state's boundaries are much blurrier than they were even 100 years ago or 50 years ago. 3 of the 5 biggest companies in the world today are making revenue from trading, not something tangible like a cassette, but something that we cannot see and measure, and they're basically trading their intellectual property. Previously, those companies would have been major contributors to their country's taxation system. In our global economy, those companies are now at liberty to transfer revenue from their Australian operations to an international subsidiary located in a low-tax jurisdiction, located being a term in inverted commas. Those low-tax jurisdictions have always been around, whether it be Switzerland or Luxembourg or the Bahamas or even the Cayman Islands, but this has implications for the Australian government. And the Australian Taxation Office has reported that from the $300 billion a year in cross-border trade, over $115 billion is channelled to very low tax jurisdictions. This is quite simply lost revenue for Australia. Our society operates by each of us contributing through our taxation system, paying the fair amount. It is how we pay for our roads, our schools, our justice system and other services. $115 billion is about what the state governments and Commonwealth governments spend on health, a health budget in 1 year. The Commonwealth budget's about $65 billion, about 61%. So think of that. That money could go into health, and think of the good it could do. If these multinational companies are not contributing to our taxation system but shifting revenue to low tax havens, then the rest of us, be it private individuals or small businesses or Australian registered corporations, we have to pick up the slack. This is particularly important in 2015 as we are an ageing Australia. The first time ever that we've had 2 generations in retirement. Good that we have improvements in health and we're able to live healthier lives, but obviously a challenge for a system that, such as the pension, when it was established, we had an average male age for males dying was about 62, and you had about 7 workers for every person on the pension, whereas now that percentage, that ratio is going down and down and down, and it won't be that far before we're getting down to 2 or 3 workers per person on the pension. That has implications for us as a nation, if we want to be the nation that recognises the fair go but also offers a helping hand for people when they get in difficult times. Obviously, most Australians live quite simply. They work or run a business in Australia and pay their fair share of tax. For the average Australian, that will be about 21% of their income. Obviously, if they're a wealthier Australian, we have a tax system that means they pay more. If they're a small business, they're paying about 30%. Of course, they might have write-offs and the like. And obviously, many small businesses don't actually make a profit, so they're not able to they don't have to pay that full 30%. If we were all able to shift our income to arrange our tax affairs such that the low tax havens were the way our income was treated, Australia as we know it would fall apart. The supportive nation would come to an end. There would be no money to pay for our wonderful education system that recognises need wherever it be, whether it be state schools or private schools. Our world-class Medicare system, something that's the envy of the world, would fall apart. Our judicial system, where we basically have a commitment to providing access to justice for all, that would come to a screaming halt. And all those other important social frameworks like childcare and the like that make our wonderful society what it is, the glue that holds this Australian community together would start to fall apart. The social contract we have as Australians is to contribute our fair share. That's what makes this country prosper. There are legitimate ways to minimise our taxation burden. A common deduction that most people have from time to time is a charitable donation. And we are a generous nation, particularly a generous nation when it comes to private individuals. It's sad to see that in the context of a coalition government that has slashed $11.3 billion from the aid budget at a time when we should be reaching out to a world. Instead, we've had have a foreign minister that has overseen an obscene slashing of our foreign aid budget. But as private individuals, Australians are always happy to put their hand in their pocket and help out our neighbours or people around the world that need a helping hand, and even domestically. We saw that when the tsunami hit our neighbours back at the start of the decade, of the last decade. And I'm sure many people here, I know the member for Kingford Smith would have put in his hand in his pocket to help the surf lifesavers, not just physically help them, but to financially help them, or the Red Cross or Oxfam, or even the Diabetes Association. I'm sure the member for Hasluck would have done the same to help out diabetes cause. I know he's passionate about that. And I've even seen it in my electorate with local groups setting up charities such as the Taiwanese or Muslim Aid to help not only the locals but people around the world that are experiencing hardship. So there is a common good to the government foregoing some tax revenue and allowing us to give that money to worthwhile charities. And often constituents come in and say they want to set up a charity or a local service organisation, and one of the first things I always say to them is, have you looked at what's available now? Are you intending, the service that you intend to provide, is that already been undertaken by an established charity? If it is money that the government is foregoing, as in a tax deduction, then it is important that it is spent wisely, otherwise the money would be better spent by the government when it is collected as tax. As politicians, we need to be ever vigilant against the constantly changing techniques being utilised to minimise tax legally. I'm not talking about criminal endeavours here, but where these techniques eventually become not in the national interest, measures should be taken to make sure that they are in the nation's interest. Perhaps even to the extent where such techniques or arrangements or loopholes become illegal or unlawful. We expect companies to utilise our country for their own prosperity. If companies are utilising Australia for their own prosperity because of our great laws and great protections, they should contribute their fair share. They are getting the benefits of the Australian system. They should put in their fair share. Evidence was presented recently before the Senate's corporate tax inquiry that one big multinational firm may have paid as little as 2% tax on the billions of dollars of revenue they earned. That is, doesn't pass the pub test. It is just not fair. As I said, these international companies or multinational companies benefit from the protections and safety and services offered by Australia, so they should pay their fair share of tax. As individual Australians do and as Australian businesses do, be they small, medium or the larger companies that stride around the world. For instance, these companies are more likely to be utilising our judicial system than most ordinary Australians, yet they are contributing very little to maintaining these judicial systems, a judicial system which at the moment is struggling from a lack of resources. Australia cannot afford to let these very prosperous multinational corporations avoid paying their full share of taxation. Tax reform for multinational companies is vital to close the loopholes that currently exist. Loopholes that allow these companies to avoid tax. As I said, we're not talking about minimising or even that they're doing something illegal, but we have to have a focus on the national interest. So Labor supports any measures that will close such loopholes and protect revenue from taxation that should be staying in Australia and benefiting Australians. Labor announced a $7.2 billion package of measures to prevent multinationals from avoiding tax by moving their profits offshore. That package was costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office. Sadly, the Abbott government rejected the measures proposed by Labor for what could only be, I guess, short-sighted political reasons. The measures contained in this bill, while welcomed as at least a measure, is untested. The government has no idea how much revenue these measures will save. In fact, just in the budget papers, we only have an asterisk, and we saw the Treasurer floundering when asked this question today. Labor has taken a bipartisan approach to this important issue and will not stand in the way of these measures. It is important that these companies contribute as they should. It is also important that all measures necessary to ensure that multinational companies pay their fair share of taxation in this country be put in place. More measures are needed to ensure that this occurs. The government needs to be serious about this issue and not tear down the measures put in place by the Australian Labor Party in 2013. Those measures required the Australian Taxation Office to publish details of the income and tax paid by companies earning more than $100 million. When it comes to taxation, transparency is important. Public companies are obliged under the Corporations Act to make sure shareholders know what's going on. Companies earning more than $100 million should be paying their fair share of tax in Australia. If they are not, then surely Australians are entitled to know this. Australians are handing over their hard-earned, fully taxed dollars to these companies on the expectation that those companies will support our Australian economy and pay their fair share also. These transparency measures only apply to about 2,000 companies in Australia. The government wants to reduce that number by about 800 companies. One has to wonder why these companies are so keen to keep secret their taxation expenditure. The government's argument is that private companies should not be held to the same level of accountability as publicly listed corporations. In fact, publicly listed corporations already have significant reporting requirements, and the measures put in place by Labor even the playing field between private companies and publicly listed corporations. If a private company is paying very little taxation, it should be called to account. It should explain why that is the case. There are sound public policy reasons for keeping these transparency measures in place. And we heard that ridiculous claim by the now member for Mining, Minister for Mining, then Assistant Treasurer Josh Frydenberg. He said that there were real concerns about the implications of the publications of the tax data of private companies. And I'm quoting from the Sydney Morning Herald article by Nassim Kadem and Gareth Hutchins from the 17th of March, where Mr Frydenberg said there were safety concerns because it made those individuals potential kidnap targets. By this logic, the BRW rich list should be closed down in the interests of safety. The article goes on to make the point that the decision to wind back the laws came amidst intense lobbying by business groups for the laws to be scrapped. I cannot see how Mr Frydenberg could come to that conclusion. Transparency measures are important. The measures in this bill are welcome. The measures Labor proposes in our $7.2 billion package of measures would go further to ensure that multinational companies are fully contributing to the economic well-being of Australia. It is a sign of a lazy government that has already run out of ideas when they take the easy road when it comes to taxation reform. And we've seen it flagged by a couple of backbenchers opposite already, hiking up the GST. Now, this is an unimaginative, simple solution that hits the poorest hardest, particularly those, if the tax is broadened to fresh food, that would particularly attack communities that are struggling with their diet. Such a hike would be no way you couldn't avoid such a hike unless you don't consume, obviously. And we can't all sit around and grow our own vegetables. A rise in GST would hit low-income Australians who can least afford to pay more tax. And obviously we can't structure our arrangements to send our finances off to Luxembourg or Switzerland or the Bahamas or even the Cayman Islands. Low-income Australians do not have many avenues to minimise their taxation burden, and this measure is temporary, is to be commended, but they need to go further.
The question is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Barker.